On the first anniversary of Russian President Vladimir Putin ordering his armies to invade Ukraine, his forces remain locked in a bloody war of attrition. Towns and cities have been devastated. Tens of thousands of civilians and fighters on both sides have been killed or even injured. Millions of people have either fled the country or been internally displaced. As the conflict which shook the world marks its first anniversary, we'll look at the gains and how far both sides are willing to stretch. Colonel Daniel L. Davis is a senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities. He is also a retired Army Lieutenant Colonel with 21 years of service, including 4 combat deployments. He's now joining us to talk more about this. Colonel Daniel, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
How would you evaluate the conflict this far?
So far, I would evaluate that through the first year of conflict is that both sides have given each other some pretty bloody shots, and both sides have taken some bloody shots. And the net result is that the lines have not moved dramatically much since about the 3rd or 4th month of the war. And now then, after these twin speeches by Vladimir Putin and Joe Biden, basically at the 1-year anniversary, both sides are really digging in. Nobody's even thinking about peace, and 2023 is setting up to be a very, very bloody year, and the death toll will continue to climb, I'm afraid.
Colonel Daniel, apart from reflecting on the war, how can the world really commemorate this anniversary? What does it mean for Ukraine, and what does it mean for Russia?
You know, I think it's just an awful blot on the world, because there's nobody is doing anything at all to even talk about peace other than just lip service. But everybody wants to win. You have the West and Zelensky, you know, they want to do everything to drive Russia completely out, and they don't care about the cost. And then on the other side, you have Russia saying, no, we're not going to leave under any circumstances because of our personnel and our people who live in the eastern part of the country and the world. I mean, you look, the West is trying to help, you know, Zelensky, so they're giving him all these weapons and ammunition. Other people in the world are a smaller number are helping Russia. And you know, the majority of the world just wants the war to be over, especially, you know, the global South, for example. They don't really have a dog in the hunt one way or the other, as we say here in Texas. They just want the war to end. But unfortunately, they don't have any of the power. And those who do have the power just seem to be trying to outdo the other to give more weapons.
With that being said, do you think there's a new narrative being created here? We saw the surprise visit by President Biden to Kyiv and then the Chinese foreign minister to Moscow. What do you make of that?
Yeah, I think that, again, just both sides right now are going all out for their side to win. And Biden making this very emotional presentation in Kyiv and then making an even bigger presentation in Warsaw a day later. And then, you know, Xi Jinping is going to go to Moscow, apparently in a few months. He also just hosted the leader of Iran. And, you know, Iran is also helping Russia. So you see kind of a quasi-alliance, really, of those folks getting together. And it's kind of negative anti-West. It's not just, you know, against Ukraine, because they view this as a proxy war. And right now you see two very diverse or very opposite camps meeting together, and the battleground is literally Ukraine.
Ukraine earned a strong backing in a non-binding vote where 141 member countries voiced support for the resolution. 7 opposed it, while 32, including China and India, abstained. The resolution reaffirmed support for Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity, rejecting any Russian claims to the parts of the country it occupies. How would you assess the role of the United Nations in the war in the past year?
I mean, we just got to be honest. Practically speaking, it's not doing anything to getting rid of or to end the war, to bring it to a conclusion, because they're not providing, you know, Russia with any kind of motivation to do anything besides go on. And these condemnations, while they certainly feel good on the Western side and through quite a bit of others for that matter, it doesn't do anything that actually brings the war to a conclusion. And until people start saying, okay, what was the reasons that Russia started this? Because unfortunately, the easy narrative is it was an unprovoked attack and it's just aggression and all this. And if that's all you believe it is, then the only thing you can do is to fight to defeat it fully. But if you recognize that from the Russian perspective, this was not unprovoked, and actually they believe it started in 2014, and if you can address their big concerns, which Putin just laid out in his speech a couple of days ago, the Russian speakers in the eastern part of the country were and remain his primary concern. And if those people aren't even addressed in this, then there's no basis for anyone to have any negotiated settlement. And if the United Nations is supposed to either prevent war or get it solved, I don't think it's doing a very good job.
Let's talk about another concern, and this is concerning the arms supplies. China says that providing arms to both Russia and Ukraine is funding the conflict and will not end the war. Russia blames the West of pumping arms to prolong the war. What do you make of those statements?
Well, I mean, both sides have their own perspective, and it's completely contradicted on the opposite side. And it just is, reiterates this conflict or the narrative that both sides want to win. So naturally, from the Russian perspective, anything and everything that the West is doing to help Ukraine is just prolonging the war. And from the other side, it's almost comical. You see, when Iran was alleged to have been providing Russia with ammunition and drones, or North Korea is alleged to be sending missiles. Everybody wants to say that's bad, but it's okay to do the other one. And the bottom line is both sides are doing everything they can to get as many weapons and ammunition from the other side as they can, because they still think they have a chance to win on the battlefield. And until one or both sides realizes that they can't accomplish with military force what they want to politically, then you'll have a chance for a negotiated settlement. But we're not even close to that right now. That's the really tragic part of this.
Colonel Daniel, I like what you said. It's all comical at the end of the day. And with that being said, how long can the West continue to arm Ukraine given its own economic compulsions?
Well, that's really the unknown factor. I mean, a lot of people thought that this winter was going to be a big problem because there was, lots of signs it looked like that there was going to be a economic downturn in the West and in the United States in particular. And so far that hasn't happened. The winter itself was very mild, so the energy issues didn't come into play near as much as people were afraid. So that kind of made it easier to continue going on. But now if that starts to change, and you're going to see in the summer, by the way, there's a couple things that aren't being talked about very much in the Western media, and that is the amount of artillery shells that the Ukraine side is using on a daily basis outstrips by 3 times the amount of production that the West can provide to replace those shells with. So unless the West is able to radically ramp up their production, they're going to be dwindling their own supplies faster than they can be replenished. And it will take about 6 to 9 months before those things can catch up. And during that time, Ukraine is going to have a real shortage of shells that the Russian side, although they have some limitations, not as much. And so it can play against them. And the second thing that really doesn't get much notice is that, yeah, you can give NATO tanks and armored personnel carriers, even jets later, but if so many Ukraine soldiers die that they don't have enough to operate them in 9 months from now and a year from now, if the war continues on, that's going to be the bigger problem. Not just can you provide enough weapons. Russia has 15 million military-aged males from which they can draw. Ukraine has just hardly a fraction of that number. And so Russia can afford to go into an attrition warfare, and Ukraine can't because of their personnel.
Colonel, with all honesty, do you think this is a proxy war of the West? Because there are no NATO boots on the ground yet. The West is fighting the war. And what is the real motive of NATO arming Ukraine?
Look, on Christmas Day, retired General Kellogg, who used to be the National Security Advisor for Vice President Pence, just flatly, openly said, of course it's a proxy war. There's no question about it. And you don't see that kind of honesty very often here. But, I mean, it's black and white. Of course it's a proxy war. I mean, we're doing everything besides pulling the trigger on this fighting over there. It's not just we're providing weapons, ammunition, training, targeting intelligence, literally everything except for pulling the trigger. So, I mean, it's the very definition of a proxy war. And unfortunately, until the Russian side can do something to impose a price for the West in using Ukraine like this, it's going to continue on. And, and of course, Ukraine wants it. So it's not like they're an unwilling partner in this, because they want all the help they can get. But the downside is that there's always this risk that one day something could happen. It could go a little too far, and then it could end up, accelerating. And then maybe you might have NATO involved, and then you have an Article 5 issue. and everything gets really, really scary at that point.
Colonel Daniel, and I want you to be brief with your response on this one. Do you think Putin will ever compromise? What will it take for this war to just end?
It will only happen when one of them believes they can't win on the battlefield what they want. And right now, Putin does not. He thinks it's on his favor. He thinks he's going to win. And until either him or Zelensky comes to a different conclusion, there will be no end to the war.
Senior fellow and military expert for defense priorities, Colonel Daniel L. Davis, thank you for your insights and for talking to WION World is One today.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.